Great. We're back to our fire ecology lecture series. In the last segment, I was talking about what are some of the adaptations and types of plant communities that are perfectly fine with fire. This is kind of novel, I would say, in the last 20 years or so, maybe 30 or 40 for the people that were starting to recognize it. But the public is now becoming aware that fire is a major part of our systems, and we need to, the trick is now to have them understand that and allow proper management practices, which are going to be different than what they're used to. So I'll get into that now. The first clear management practice we've had about fire that had to be overruled, if you will, maybe that's too strong of a word, but fire suppression, right? Keeping fire out. It's not part of the ecology of the system. Not exactly true, as you'll see, and has created, I've already mentioned, it created some pretty devastating effects. So you've already seen part of this picture. This is from the Scientific American article that I'm having you, or had you read. The fire scars, you could see, have recorded 300 years of fire in Yosemite Valley. And what's cool about this particular image, so you could see that in 1896 there was a fire, 1885, 1869, 1864, 1851. What are we talking about? Every 10 years? 1844, 1834. Here's a short one, 1828. Here's a real short one, 1823, 1820, okay, so you get the point. And you could just see, you can't quite see it because of the image copying from the article image, but each one of these is a fire scar, a fire event. And then if you go all the way up to the top, you notice that the Europeans arrive, and in 1896 was the last fire. And look at all that wood, all that growth. For 100 years. Prior to that, the fire regime had a periodicity of approximately 10 years. After the Europeans get in there and say fire is bad, it's 100 years of fire, absence of fire. And then a chainsaw got involved in 1994. So this shows nicely the natural fire regime, but we'll talk about what natural fire regime actually means. It's not so easily defined, as it turns out. But for 100 years, basically no European influence, and then Europeans arrive and that changes everything. Okay, and fire's taken away. And you can see that 100-year prior to that, you know, the tree was okay. The fires were part of that system, right? Okay. So let me explain what the impacts are. So here is an image. There were painters that were pretty fascinated then and now with Yosemite Valley. And so I've been able to pull some of these old paintings up from the late 1800s as a sort of historical record of what the valley looked like, okay, prior to the Europeans removing fire. And now these are paintings, so if you know anything about painters, especially painters of the European courts and things, they make the emperors and the kings and the queens look really good. And so there's some artistic license always. Same thing here. But we can still see this is a ponderosa pine right here, right? It's long, straight tree bole. These right here are oak, Quercus, potentially agrifolia, right here. And those oaks are perfectly fine with fire too. They have a different way of handling it, but they can resprout. So you can see that the valley floor is not loaded up with pines in this picture. It's kind of a mixed wood of both oak and pine. All right. Here's another image from the same general period. It has Bambi down here. I'm sure they stayed still as this guy painted through the sunset that lasted for, however long he took to paint it. I'm assuming it was a he. That's El Capitan right there. And if you look, there's El Cap. If you look down in the valley floor, the shape of those are not necessarily pines. They are oak. Okay? And there's a lack of pines. Why? Because the Native Americans were constantly igniting fires. That's what was driving that periodicity in part. Yosemite was the chief of the tribe in the area. And it's sad that when we talk about Yosemite, we often don't mention that. But it's true. They were lighting fires. Also, there was lightning strikes and things like that, but not so much brush and undergrowth that catastrophic fires got ignited when they would light a fire. It was the burning of the grassland. Now, why were the Native Americans burning? You'll learn that in in the next segment. But I'll tell you right now, it was because the oaks were dropping their acorn. And acorn was the cash crop, so to speak, for the group. And in order to pick those acorns out of the ground easier, they just burned off the grass every season, which coincided nicely to right after the oaks had dropped, the acorns, yay ESF, the acorns. And then they'd go out and just pick up the acorns and have a massive stash of acorns or cash for the rest of the year. So they're lighting these fires, and the seedlings are not surviving. The oak seedlings, after they get to a certain size, can survive. Okay, a pine seedling doesn't have thick enough bark yet. An oak seedling just resprouts. So that's the difference. And then here's another image from the same period, roughly. I should really get the dates on these and the authors, and I apologize, the artists. I apologize to them. But anyway, roughly the same period. This is Bridal Veil Falls here. Again, El Capitan, no one climbing it at this time. Way back here in the mist is Half Dome. That'll come important sort of in a little bit. Now you can see a few more pines in there. Interesting, artistic license teepees, very useful if you're on the go all the time, like in the prairies, but this particular artist decided that Yosemite's group was also using teepees. Okay, now, we've already talked about the idea that there is a lack of pine in these images, right? Move ahead to a picture I took when I taught high school in the Bay Area. I was a co-leader of a group that went backpacking or camping every month. Just a core group of students, high school kids, that had that sort of adventure thing going for them. And so every year I would take them to Yosemite Valley in May, which was when the peak snow melt was happening. And so we could get up there and just, the waterfalls were just phenomenal. And it was a very beautiful time. And I took this picture one year from, I think it's called Inspiration Point. And you could look in this valley and see, if you looked close enough or if the picture was good enough, you would see a few scattered oaks. But it's now a dome over here on the left. But it has converted to a pine forest because fire was removed in the late 1800s. And as a result, the pines got a chance to outcompete the oaks. The oaks are still there, but not as much. So that leads us to understanding a little bit about the dynamics, what happens when you take a fire out of the system. Here's some pictures from old photography, 1899 and 1961, and you can see the shift happening already. So over on the left, it's an oak savanna with a few scattered pines. Again, a little hard to see with this image, but if you look at the shape, you start to pick out that the broad, sort of roundish shape are the oaks, and then like this one here is a pine, nice straight pine. But also relatively open, right? And then if you go to the other slide, pretty much the same vantage point, you can see that the pines have very quickly moved in. Quickly, what's that? 60 years they moved in. And here we are with a pine forest. And then that picture I had, I can go back to it, that's just a pine stand now, right? Not stand, but all the, Curry Village and all the places that people go to are in that pine stand. Okay. Now, things get interesting though, because now that system is way out of equilibrium for the site. That word is a treacherous word in plant ecology, equilibrium, because it really kind of harkens back to that old view we talked about a couple lectures ago, that there's a balance of nature. For brief periods of time, there probably is a balance of nature in locations, and depending on where you are, that's how long that brief period lasts. But the equilibrium state, if you will, I'm kind of making this up, okay, just to be clear, but the equilibrium state for Yosemite Valley is probably oak savanna. Now we have an equilibrium state that's not too well in equilibrium, but when we walk in there with our perception of space and time, the human perception of space and time, it looks like it's a pine forest. But actually, there's evidence to suggest that's not what should be there. A, because fire was taken out, but B, what happens to those pines over time? They were doing great for 100 years. But now look at this slide here, where we could see evidence that the equilibrium has really pushed to the wrong location, if you will. In 1975, they started having trouble because trees were falling over onto cabins and campsites and concession stands. This is in the valley floor. You can see some of the concessions over here around Curry Village, if you've ever been there, right in here. But over in here, there were campgrounds and things like that, and trees were falling over. I don't think anybody died. Maybe a couple cars were lost. These are pockets of root rot. And if you take forest pathology, you'll learn about a fungus called Heterobasidium anosum. That was getting into the roots, and researchers at Berkeley Forest Pathology found out that not only was it getting into the roots, but when they cut the tree down, the roots stayed down there, the fungus stayed down there and sent out runners and would infect the neighboring tree. So these are probably mostly individual root pockets with a single tree that was infecting the trees around it, okay? And again, they were falling, and that was a problem. They tried to figure out how to get rid of the fungus. No, not going to happen. So they started to cut them all down as a preventative so that they wouldn't fall down. And so by 1989, it's just a huge, massive, empty zone. If you walk in there today, if you're a kid or an adult, you wouldn't notice. You would just say, oh, they must be doing something here. There's just not as many trees there, and it looks like a nice little open area. That's fine compared to back around that root rot. But they basically walled it off in a sense, got rid of all the infected trees, didn't let anything get established in there, except the oaks. The oaks actually don't get affected by the Heterobasidium. So the oaks actually are coming back. So now we might be going back in the equilibrium to an oak savanna with scattered pine, right? An effect first removing the pines with fire by the Native Americans, bringing them back by removing the fire, and now a pathogen is saying, oh man, salad bar, this is perfect. I love pine. And maybe that's the beginning, as all those trees would fall, if they were allowed, building up fuel and encouraging the next fire, and then the oaks are taking back over. Again, the oaks are not directly affected by the Heterobasidium root rot, so they do okay in a root rot center. All right, so clearly humans have had a massive impact in Yosemite Valley and pretty much everywhere. There is fire. Australia, California, Oregon, the plains, Africa, Sweden, right? New York, Pennsylvania. The more we look at it, the more we realize that fire was an agricultural tool that the Native Americans used to encourage the plants and the animals that they needed to help them harvest them. Okay, so let's look at some of this. Indigenous peoples, they use fire to generate new growth for food, shoots, seedlings for herbs, or of herbs, And also the new growth created fodder for game, which was an even better, potentially, I guess it's the meat part of their diet. Back to the Jesuit priests that were writing about the Native Americans in California. I read a devastating little segment from someone. I don't remember who his name was, but he was one of those Jesuit priests, and he said, writing home, he said the Native Americans look a lot like cattle grazing on the farm. And he was explaining that he saw them on their hands and knees eating the grass that was coming up. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. They were picking those shoots and using them for cooking and things like that. But they might have even been picking them, eating them raw, just like you do with your garden in the back. If you've got peas or lettuce or things, it's real sweet, and you occasionally take a bite. But anyway, it's just so discouraging to see people write things like that, to me. Okay, so create fodder for game. Also drive the game past hunters. So they might create 2 fires or 1 fire. This was very common in the plains. They'd have a whole wall of fire across the grass. Nothing devastating, nothing you couldn't basically run through probably and be okay with it. But the animals would bolt and run in one direction, and they might have them kind of channel into an area where then the hunters were waiting to knock off a few for food. Also, they would use that with a cliff nearby, and then it was you don't have to use your arrows to kill the animals. And I've already mentioned the burning off of grasses to expose acorns, but also tubers. A lot of those in California, but other places, beautiful native flowers form sort of tubers under the ground. And that's what resprouts. It's not the seed. But if you find those and eat them, they're wonderfully good food. Okay. So the Native Americans, I'll go back, have a positive interaction with fire. They're using it as an agricultural tool, right? We didn't really think of it that way until recently, and I don't think they thought of it that way. They didn't need to. This is a Western imposition on these ideas, but they were using it very effectively as an agricultural tool. We come along, at least people like me, the Europeans, and fire becomes a very different situation. Arson, escaped campfires, sparks from railroads, sparks from cars, burning cigarettes. These are the concepts we have with the human relation with fire on the landscape. These are fires that are being ignited by humans and causing devastating effects. We eventually get something called the Smokey Bear campaign, and it was one of the most successful public relations campaign ever, still being used today. I see it in airports all the time. Drives me nuts. But beginning in 1944, and that date is relatively important, Smokey Bear, notice there's no "the" there, Smokey Bear posters encouraged the public to help prevent forest fires. Now, Smokey was a little cub that was found after a fire by the Forest Service and became, quote, the poster child, and survived, but had some burnt paws, I believe. What happened at that time that caused that PR campaign to get initiated? This was, again, in 1944. There was a war going on, and a lot of men and women were off fighting the war. There was a submarine, apparently, off the coast of California near Santa Barbara, north of Santa Barbara, that lobbed a small bomb up on the coastal plain. And it started a fire that really took off and was quite devastating. No firemen, no firewomen, but at that time, no firemen around to put it out. And that kind of scared people in a big way because everybody was off fighting the fire. What they didn't need is massive fires back home. And so the Forest Service, there was a movie that had just come out. You may recognize this particular cartoon of a deer. I know I've shown this movie 100 times now, not 100, but a lot of times to my kids. I forget, is that Bambi or his dad? I forget. I think it's his dad. I think it's Bambi, sorry, at the end of the movie. But anyway, the Forest Service contacts Walt Disney and says, hey, you've got a fire in that movie and the animals survive it, but it's devastating and it probably impacts children's lives for the rest of their lives. How many of you saw that and thought, oh my God, I'm so sad, right? I know my kids, I had to kind of walk them out of it because it's a fairly dramatic event in a cartoon. Anyway, Disney says okay, and he starts this campaign that only you can prevent wildfires, and we should put them all out so that our forests don't become a once upon a time situation. And again, we're still using this today, even though we know that it doesn't make sense to put every fire out. And that'll be the segment, that's what I'm going to go into next. How are we managing our forests now to both incorporate fire and be safe? Incorporate fire for the organisms there that need it, but be safe and not hurt ourselves or our structures or even other organisms that may not need it as much, right? So that'll be the topic of our next segment, and I hope you have a good next part of your day. Thank you.